In this session, we're going to explore the notion and the nature of assessing the anaerobic capacity. Now, in previous sessions, we have covered themes such as high-intensity physiology, and we've also got a previous session which has addressed how we assess anaerobic power. So if you're not sure of the distinction between power and capacity, it's perhaps worth going back to one of the earlier sessions. So in this session, what we're going to primarily focus on are these three aspects. We're going to understand the methods and the protocols that are available to us, and they come under a number of different headings. We've got protocols that are referred to as constant load. We've got protocols which are, in essence, using lactate as the proxy indicator of the anaerobic capacity. We've got protocols which use a very clever technique of the accumulated oxygen deficit. And then finally, we've got what is a critical power-based method. We're then going to think about these critically. In that sense, what we're going to do is try to understand them in terms of the underlying physiology. Do they actually physiologically meet the criteria of what the definition of anaerobic capacity is? And then finally, we're going to get to the notion of understanding their validity and reliability. That is, as we've referred to in previous sessions, do they do what it says on the tin? That's validity. And if we were to test, retest, do we get the same score? Because a test has to be both valid and reliable in order for us to adopt that test. So to that end, what we need to start off with is the idea of a rationale. Why do we want to assess anaerobic capacity? Because fundamentally, previous sessions we've discussed the idea of power, and the power seems to be quite an obvious one, the rate at which the work has been done. So the rate at which, for example, strength is converted over time. Makes a lot of sense. You can understand how that would be applicable to a lot of sports, whether it be the throwing events, the jumps, or even if it's into sports such as tennis and badminton, with moving of the racket head. But what about capacity? Where does capacity fit in, which is that notion of a sustained energy release from anaerobic substrate metabolism? Now, this is really important, and actually the rationale for this is quite clear. A lot of activities and sports are actually performed at intensities which are by definition supramaximal, i.e. they are either performed in excess of VO2 max, which means they are solely based on anaerobic metabolism, or near enough solely based on anaerobic metabolism. In other words, the highest sustainable workload for aerobic metabolism is VO2 max, so anything in excess of that must be dependent upon anaerobic based metabolism. Excuse me. So if we think about events such as the 400 meters, the 800 meters, and to a degree something like the 1500 meters, they have got a very high anaerobic contribution to them, which we'll look at in a moment. Therefore, in those events, it's not about the rate at which the energy is released. It's how well that energy release from anaerobic metabolism can be sustained. How big is the capacity, the tank, to be able to perform that work? So if you take a sport such as the 800 meters, and if you think about the 800 meters where you've got athletes running 2 400-meter laps on the track, and in the men's events, they're probably hitting at the elite level first 400 meters in about 48 seconds. Okay, so you only have to equate that and think about the world's best 400-meter runners just running floor flat and running about 44 seconds. So this is very much a sport that's got a large anaerobic contribution. So whereas we might be assessing the aerobic contribution in a lot of endurance sports, there is also this large anaerobic contribution that has to be accounted for. So it's fundamentally important that we understand how much that contributes to an event, and therefore we have to be able to assess it. So this is really the crux of what is going on. Any sport that requires sustained energy release from anaerobic metabolism must require the use of the anaerobic capacity. So we can probably rule out events like a marathon, for example. Although there is a use of anaerobic energy, it's such a very small component to that event that we could probably rule it out. But if we start to come down to those kind of more, in inverted commas, traditionally accepted anaerobic events, the 400, the 800 on the track, then fundamentally being able to assess and understand that role that the anaerobic capacity plays is really important, both in terms of perhaps monitoring training, monitoring recovery, monitoring perhaps an athlete who's coming back from an injury. Really very, very important parameter to assess. And if we think about endurance sports, and endurance is traditionally aerobic, we'd say 1500 meters is an endurance sport, but as you're about to see, there's a large anaerobic contribution in that event. So this is some data from Gaston, which is a tremendous paper actually published in Sports Medicine. And in here, what you can see is on our x-axis, you can see that we've got the distance in meters. On the y-axis, we've got energy supply. Now, be careful and don't be worried about the units here. So the energy supply here is in mils of O2. So that's mils of O2, which is equivalent over a minute. So don't worry what that is. Okay, we're going to discuss this later on. But in essence, what they're using is they're using this parameter on the y-axis as our proxy indicator of the energy contribution. So that's informing us about the totality of the energy. What we've then got is what Gaston is showing us is the separation across each of these track disciplines between the aerobic and anaerobic contributions. So what we can see, for example, if we take a 200 meters track running race, so at the world's best level in the males, that's something like, let's say, 20 seconds or quicker. In an event like that, what we can see is that the total energy contribution is around about just under 50 mils of O2 per minute, of which it looks pretty close that 3/4 of the energy is coming from anaerobic metabolism. Now, we haven't separated that out in this, but we can be certain that there's only two sources of anaerobic energy. There's only energy which can come from the high energy phosphates, so that would be, for example, ATP-PC or the adenylate kinase reaction, or energy which is coming from anaerobic glycolysis. But nonetheless, what we can see in our 200 meter race is there's a large contribution from anaerobic metabolism. Now clearly, a lot of that is about power, how quickly they can get up to the speed that they need to. But they've got to sustain that. So there is an anaerobic contribution going on. If we go to the 400 meters, now this is where it gets quite interesting. So we go to the 400 meters, now the total energy cost is far greater. The total energy cost has gone up from about, let's call it 45, it's gone up to about 75 mils of O2 per minute. So that's the total energy cost. The anaerobic cost has risen a little bit. It's gone from, let's say, well, what's this about? Let's say 30. It's probably gone up to about 40. Okay, so we've got a slight increase, but it's looking like that the anaerobic contribution is just over half of the total energy contribution for a 400 meter race. But when we get to the 800 and 1500 meter races, there's something really important going on here. Firstly, obviously, as the duration of the event increases, the total energy cost increases, and you can see that we're kind of getting to that scope where it's doubling really. As the distance doubles, the total energy cost is pretty much doubling. But if you look at the 800 and 1500, and in fact even the 400, what you can see is that the total contribution from anaerobic metabolism doesn't really change. And so what that is telling us is what we can see is in these events, the 4, the 8 and the 1500 as an example, that they've taxed the anaerobic capacity. There is no more energy that can be derived anaerobically. If there were, then these would be bigger blocks within the overall energy contribution. So this is important because this tells us that the capacity is finite, which makes sense. That we understand this is why we can't sustain energy for, anaerobic energy for prolonged periods of time. We understand that the anaerobic reserve is limited. Once you've used up that anaerobic energy, it's gone. The only way you can get it back, as we learnt in the previous session, which is on high intensity physiology, is through doing lower intensity exercise or the complete cessation of exercise. Well, that doesn't happen in a track event. So the capacity is being used up. So the aerobic contribution is far greater, but the anaerobic contribution in terms of the total energy doesn't change. The relative contribution to the overall event has clearly changed. It's gone up from about 50% in the 400 to about, 33% for the 800, and it's about 1/6 of the energy contribution for the 1500 meters. But the total actual contribution from anaerobic metabolism is the same because it's a capacity. So the limiting factor really in terms of the anaerobic metabolism is the size of the capacity of the individual. So the larger the anaerobic capacity, the greater the anaerobic contribution can be. And in events like 800 and 1500 meter running, a larger anaerobic capacity means higher sustainable speeds. Because remember that our ATP turnover rate is faster from anaerobic metabolism than it is from aerobic metabolism. Now, if we carry on looking at this work from Gaston, a lot of that kind of is borne out here. If you look at the figure on the left, which looks a little bit complicated because there's a lot of things going on, but in essence, we've seen this figure before. We can see on the x-axis we've got time in seconds. We've got 90 seconds. So this is an example of maximum intensity exercise over 90 seconds. So it doesn't really conform to any of our kind of conventional track events. It's probably the equivalent of running a 600 meters on the track. Okay, so it's pretty tough going. So it's flat out. And what you can see is you can see the difference in the relative contribution from the aerobic and anaerobic metabolism in endurance and sprint-based athletes. So sprint-based are kind of more anaerobically honed, and endurance-based are clearly more aerobically honed based athletes. And what you can see is that the energy demand is highest at the start, because in essence at the start what you can see is the energy is primarily coming from the ATP-PC systems here. So you can see you've got the high turnover rate. But as soon as we know that starts to decline, we get a contribution now to the overall energy demand from glycolysis and the aerobic metabolism of glucose and fats. So the total energy demand starts to decline. But notice that fundamentally in this 90-second block of exercise, notice how much of the energy is really coming from anaerobic sources, from glycolysis and ATP-PC. So these play an enormous role. This is in a 90-second block of work. And if we come over to the table on the right and we look from 0 to 90 seconds, here we can see the anaerobic contribution is 44%. So that is fundamentally really important. We need to understand that. We need to understand all of these are telling us, even if it's an event of 4 minutes, so 4 minutes would be the equivalent of perhaps a team pursuit or an individual pursuit, for example, on the velodrome, 4,000 meters on the velodrome. So a fifth of the energy is coming from anaerobic sources. So as a physiologist and as a coach, you would really want to know that. You'd want to know if the training that you've been adopting has actually increased that as a capacity. But we also need to understand that the capacity is a function of both the high energy phosphates, which we've already said is the ATP-PC plus the adenylate kinase, and from substrate level glycolysis. So both of these play an important part in terms of the anaerobic capacity. So it's a really important measurement to have. Imagine if you didn't have that, and you've got an athlete that's doing events, let's say they're doing the 800 meters, which is about 120 seconds. If you didn't know about that, that'd be over a third of the total energy provision that you wouldn't understand where it's coming from. You wouldn't know how it was responding to training. So you can see why it's such a fundamentally important parameter and why we need to have optimal ways of assessing it. And in fact, if we just go to this data, which was published not so long ago, in fact, in Nature, and we've seen this again in previous sessions, but again, what you can see is the relative contribution on the y-axis, so very similar to what we've just been looking at. And on the x-axis, you can see the intensity. That's the percentage of VO2 max. So in the three columns that you've got here, all of these are by definition submaximal. They are below VO2 max. They are traditionally what we refer to as more aerobic, okay, because they're below VO2 max, and VO2 max is our ceiling for aerobic metabolism. But notice what you can see going on here. So for example, if you look at 65% VO2 max, you can see a large proportion of the energy, the total energy, is coming from muscle glycogen. Muscle glycogen. So we don't know, because it's not specific, but that is certainly going to have an anaerobic contribution. Yes, you can use glycogen aerobically, but there will be an anaerobic contribution. Remember that at no point is any energy system turned off. They're all working simultaneously. And you can see that the contribution gets significantly greater. In fact, at about 85% VO2 max, it's half, if not more, than the total energy contribution is coming from glycogen, of which a large proportion will be from anaerobic metabolism. So although we've perhaps been predicating our kind of arguments to the exercise which is at intensities beyond VO2 max, don't be fooled into thinking it is just about exercise beyond VO2 max. There is clearly that contribution to exercise which is aerobic as well. That there is a large anaerobic contribution to that kind of exercise as well. Now, one of the issues that we face, as we face in any area of science, is having a definition that works for us. And I'm going to show you the definition and then come back to the issues that we have with the definition. So this is the definition that we work towards. This is from Green. It's published in European Journal of Applied Physiology. And it is without doubt the best definition that exists for the anaerobic capacity. So anaerobic capacity is defined as the maximum amount of ATP resynthesized via anaerobic metabolism by the whole organism during a specific type of short duration maximal exercise. So in other words, it's about not rate, amount, the amount of ATP resynthesized via anaerobic metabolism. So that's fundamentally important. That's what the capacity is. It's the amount. It's how big something is the capacity. So the reason I wanted to show you that first is because I now want to just look at the issues that we face with a lot of the proposed definitions. So if we take, for example, the original one, which is the Vestra one, which is at the very, very top. So here the definition is the rate of lactate production is considered to be a good measure of the anaerobic capacity of muscle. And in fact, Green does a lot of the work for us. Firstly, they say, well, it neglects the other metabolic contributions to anaerobic capacity, and two, it's the incorrect use of the dimensions of physical power. So they're saying they've got rate. Remember, this is capacity, it's not a rate. The second one, which is the Bennett, again, they refer to lactic acid. Okay, same problem here, because it ignores all the other energy pathways. If we take for the third one, anaerobic capacity of the organism is the key system connected with the release of energy for sports performance lasting up to 120 seconds. Now, this is really important. So, why does it have to be 120 seconds? We've already seen that in this example here, that we've got duration of exercise up to 240 seconds, so double what they're recommending, which has still got a large anaerobic contribution. So why is it time limited like that? So fundamentally, a lot of these proposed definitions are not fit for purpose. So this is where that definition from Green came from. That it was about, one, it's not about rate. Two, it's not just limiting it to one substrate pool. Three, it's not about being time limited. What we're trying to do is we're going to have to find a test, if we're assessing anaerobic capacity, that one, can allow us to tax both the high energy phosphates and substrate level glycolysis. Two, it is not a time limited protocol. And three, it doesn't just limit to one substrate pathway. So it's got to be fit for all of those kind of purposes. And to that end, I just want to show you this. Now, again, don't be concerned by a lot of the things that are going on here. But I just wanted to show you this because this is really interesting to kind of give us a little understanding of kind of what contributes to the anaerobic capacity. So in this example, this is taken from Medbo, which is an incredibly famous paper actually in the field of anaerobic capacity assessment. But what they've done is they've estimated what contribution, where the contributions come to the overall anaerobic capacity. So what you can see is that even when we're working in excess of VO2 max, which is what is happening here. So in this example here, the participants in the study would have been working at about 120% VO2 max. Actually, there's about a 9% contribution to the total energy turnover, excuse me, which is coming from O2, which is stored in the blood and muscle. So this is just O2, which is stored potentially in myoglobin, and that contributes because it's used to provide the environment for the ATP. So there's a 9% contribution. 24% is coming from the high energy phosphates. So ATP PCR, adenylate kinase. 51% is actually coming from glycolysis. They're using lactate in muscle as their proxy indicator. Remember that lactate is produced under higher amounts in response to oxygen being limited. In other words, in response to the fact that the intensity exercise is high, anaerobic metabolism. And then the final one is about 16% is lactate transferred to blood. In other words, this is the notion of the fact that there is an aerobic contribution to this, which is coming from lactate that is moved out of the muscle cell and is actually being converted back to glucose, or that is being converted back to pyruvate, and the hydrogen ions from it are being shoved down the electron transport chain. So there's a number of key things, but the big thing to unpackage here is we have to be able to take into account, when we're assessing capacity, both the high energy phosphates and glycolysis, which is in essence in this example here, that accounts for about 76% of what is happening in exercise, in this case for about 2 minutes. Okay, so a large contribution of what is going on. So it's a slightly long-winded way of demonstrating it, but it's fundamentally really important for kind of establishing that we have to take both of those in account. As the definitions did, so too do we when we're assessing this as a parameter. So let's keep this definition in mind. The anaerobic capacity is the maximum amount of ATP resynthesized via anaerobic metabolism by the whole organism during a specific type of short duration maximal.